بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. قال الله تعالى في كتاب العزيز بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما صلى الله عليه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah ta'ala, we're going to continue with our beloved Seerah of our beloved Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And today I wanted to focus on two aspects, inshallah ta'ala, if time permits. The first is I want to talk about some of the early companions that accepted Islam and who they were and their significance and the amazing people that they were and the amazing sacrifices that they made and the roles they had in their early days and how we can learn lessons from that. And then inshallah ta'ala we'll talk about some of the persecution that Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam had to face during his time in the early stages in Mecca. If you can't tell by my voice, I am feeling a little bit under the weather. So, depending on how I feel, we may cut class short today. But let's begin with the companion by the name of Az-Zubair ibn al-Awwam, who is one of the Ashra Mubashara, the one of the 10 promised paradise. He was one of the first few people to accept Islam under the da'wah of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And he was Khadija radiyallahu anha's nephew, as well as the paternal cousin of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And his name will come up significantly in the Seerah, so we don't have to cover too much about him today, but he played a very critical role even after the passing of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He is constantly engaged with the Muslim Ummah. He was constantly engaged with leadership, and he was constantly engaged with bringing others to Islam. And Zubair ibn Awam radiallahu anh, his status is solidified and cemented very clearly when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned him as one of the 10 companions that are promised paradise in the famous narration in Surah At-Tirmidhi. Then there's Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who is also one of the Ashra Mubashara. And he was very close to the beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was a leader of his own. He was a very successful individual, very crafty businessman, very successful businessman. He was one of those individuals where no matter what he did, he was good at it. He was good at whatever he did. And when Abdurrahman ibn Auf, when he migrated to Medina, he was paired with an Ansari. During that time, Rasulullah had this brother system, this buddy system going on where when the Meccans migrated to Medina, one Meccan was paired with one Madani, so that the Meccans can kind of teach the Madanis their religion, because most of the Madanis are going to be new to the religion at this point, and the Madanis can take care of the Meccans because they're being hosted in their city. So it was kind of a pretty good exchange. And this was very successful as well, by the way, and it teaches us a lot about how to establish brotherhood and sisterhood and community and family, which we'll talk about in detail, including talking about the Constitution of Medina and how that is the best constitution that has ever bestowed this world and how it is the perfect and what leads to success 100% of the time. So his Ansari brother offered Abdurrahman ibn Auf some money to get him on his feet. But Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he respectfully declined. He just wanted to know where the marketplace was. And so he sold some of the goods that he had that he was able to carry with him in Mecca. and he was able to exchange it for a good amount of money, and that money he was able to exchange for other goods, and other goods was able to exchange for more amounts of money, and he kept that investment process going, and then he ended up actually becoming a successful businessman in Medina that he as well left behind in Mecca. Because in Mecca, to migrate, you had to pretty much leave everything behind. There's no bank account. You can't just carry over your money to one place to another. You have to carry your wealth, you have to carry your stuff, and to migrate from Mecca to Medina, a lot of companions had to do it secretly. A lot of companions had to do it privately. So they couldn't just carry that stuff over. So Abdurrahman ibn Auf, being a successful millionaire, if you want to imagine a billionaire, he had to leave all that behind just to go to Medina, right? But then he was able to be successful again in Medina and get on his feet. The mother of Abdurrahman ibn Auf was a very good friend of Rasulullah's mother, Amina bint Wahb. She was actually present during the time of the birth of Rasulullah. So her name is Al-Shifa bint Auf, and she is the mother of Abdurrahman ibn Auf, radiallahu ta'ala an. And Al-Shifa bint Auf is, the narrations that talk about a light emanating from Amina bint Wahb and a light reaching Sham, and the whole place, the whole area was completely covered in light, and Rasulullah prostrating when he was born. All those narrations that you actually, most of them come from Ash-Shifa bint Auf. Abdurrahman ibn Auf was also known for his taqwa. He was known for his God consciousness. He was very, very conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is why, again, his status is very clearly cemented in being in the Ashra al-Bashara, and that's all you really need to know about how amazing of an individual he was. However, when Rasulullah ﷺ was listing the names of the Ashra al-Bashara, when he was listing the names of the Ashra al-Bashara, there's a narration that tells us that the Prophet ﷺ told Abdurrahman ibn Auf that you have guaranteed access to Jannah. You will get it. However, you will be lagging behind. Right? Most likely you will be the last of the Ashra al-Bashara to enter paradise. So Abdurrahman ibn Auf, he asked why. And so Rasulullah ﷺ said that you will be busy being taken into account. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be taking you into account for a very long time and answering for all the wealth that you possess. So it teaches us a very profound lesson. So it's not a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing necessarily. He's not saying that, oh, because you have a lot of wealth, this is bad and you're going to be held accountable. No, what's happening here is Rasulullah ﷺ is telling us that for every bit of possessions that we have, for every blessing that is given to us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to ask us on the Day of Judgment what we did with that blessing. And so Abdurrahman ibn Auf, being a very successful businessman, very huge, in riches, and during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Prophet ﷺ told him that you are going to have to take a long time being held accountable because of how much do you possess. Alhamdulillah, because Abdurrahman ibn Auf is the Ashra al-Bashara, that tells us that he used his possessions for good. He used his possessions for good, alhamdulillah ta'ala. However, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, being someone of taqwa, this weighed very heavily on him. Subhanallah, the companions are on another level. Abdurrahman ibn Auf is being guaranteed Jannah. Not only Jannah, like you're in the top 10. Like you're like top 10 of all time. And Abdurrahman ibn Auf is being guaranteed Jannah, but he's still worried about his accountability. He's still worried about his accountability. It was a heavy burden on him to hear from Rasulullah ﷺ that he will be taken a long time into account. Right? This was their taqwa. This was their taqwa. That you can be guaranteed Jannah, but they would still have that fear somehow. And I think that's the perfect example of what it means to have balance of hope and fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It weighed so heavily on him that during the Khilafah of Uthman radiallahu anhu, there was a very huge trade caravan that arrived in Medina. And the caravan was so big that it entered into the city, it went all the way to the end of the city, and the last bit of the caravan was still coming in. So from one end of the city to the other end. And so the whole city was buzzing at the arrival of this caravan. Right? And so Aisha radiallahu anha, she comes out of her home and she asks, what's going on? Someone told her that Abdurrahman ibn Auf's caravan has come home. And he's just loaded. He's bawling. And so Abdurrahman ibn Auf, or Aisha radiallahu anha, goes to Abdurrahman ibn Auf and sends him a message, says, congratulations. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put barakah in your wealth. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless your wealth, make it for good. And remember what the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam told you. And so Aisha radhiyallahu anha was looking out for Abdurrahman ibn Auf. Because Abdurrahman ibn Auf was so beloved to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Aisha radhiyallahu anha wanted to make sure that he's keeping his wealth in check. And so Abdurrahman ibn Auf, hearing this, he broke down into tears. He broke down into tears. He remembered what Rasulullah ﷺ said about his accountability on the Day of Judgment. And so he gave everything from the first part of the caravan to the last caravan away as sadaqah. The whole thing. The whole thing. He says, I don't want any of it when it goes to me to the grave. Right? That's what's so beautiful about the life of Rasulullah ﷺ as well. You'll see during this journey that we're talking about Seerah, that Rasulullah ﷺ, in terms of wealth that came into his hands during his lifetime, that crossed his path during his lifetime, there are some scholars that have tried to estimate it. Allah Ta'ala, how much it was, but it ranges from between like $4 million to $40 million in his lifetime. That the Prophet ﷺ, that was either like in his hands or came across his path. This is the same Nabi which Aisha radiallahu anha said in Medina, not in Mecca, when he was in power, that there would be months that would go on where we would not turn on the stove once and we would only eat dates and water. Al-aswadain, dates and water. It makes you think. Makes you think that Rasulullah ﷺ, knowing about material possessions and what it means in the grave, if it's not used for good, he gave it all away. So Allah Ta'ala alam how much wealth he had during his lifetime, but what's guaranteed for sure is he didn't die with a penny to his name. He gave it all away. Right? And so Abdurrahman ibn Auf is a strategic thinker in this way. So this was displayed by the confidence of Rasulullah ﷺ to place him in the Ashra al-Bashara and always rely on him when it came to strategy, when it came to leadership. And the rest of the Sahaba also had a lot of confidence in Abdurrahman ibn Auf. They trusted Abdurrahman ibn Auf. He was a very trustworthy individual. So much so that before Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh passed away, he appointed a council. He said that there was going to be 6 companions that after I pass away will determine who is going to be the next Khalifa. So he appointed the 6 companions, this council, and he elected 6 Sahaba. And he told them that once I pass away, your guys' job is to lock yourself in a room and not one of you is allowed to come out until you vote for the next Khalifa. Now, the 6 of them, some of them asked, very rightfully so, what happens if there's a tie? 6. There's got to be a tiebreaker somehow. And the Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anh said that Abdurrahman ibn Auf's vote will count as 2. He was one of the 6. His will count as 2. If there's a tie, whichever side Abdurrahman is on, then that's the side that gets to be the Khalifa. And long story short, that ended up being Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu ta'ala an. So that's Abdurrahman ibn Auf, right? An individual who teaches us that just because you're wealthy does not mean you have to be an evil person. As a matter of fact, if your wealth opens up doors of khair for you, if your wealth opens up doors of ibadah to you, opens up doors of good in your life, then this is blessed. This is a blessed type of wealth, right? This is a blessed type of wealth. But if your wealth is something that will cause people harm, will turn you away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will distance you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, will cause you to engage in evil things, will cause you to be an oppressor, then this is cursed. It's a cursed type of wealth, right? How many billionaires and millionaires are we seeing now? And they have billions of dollars, yet they're a slave. Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, all of them are slaves. I'm telling you, all of them are slaves. Because they can't say what they want to say. They have to succumb to the system. They have to appease governments. They have to make sure that politicians aren't mad at them. They can't have freedom of speech. They have to censor people. And they're constantly worried about, oh, I might lose $4 billion here, $6 billion here, even though I have $100 billion to my name, my net worth, Now I know, people are going to say, oh, net worth isn't the same as liquid cash and whatnot. Forget all that. The point is that they have more than enough money for somebody to spend in 1,000 lifetimes. Whether it's in this asset or this asset, who cares? Yet they're all slaves, all of them. They all have cursed wealth. Wallahi, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put their la'na on that wealth. Because they're tongue-tied, they can't help people with that wealth, they can't do anything. They're constantly just stressed, they're constantly worried. It is a cursed type of wealth. These are not smart people. I'm telling you right now, these are not smart people. Mark Zuckerberg, when he was held accountable and had to testify for his algorithms on Facebook and it spreading hate, and it promoting hate so that people can continue to engage with Facebook so ad revenue can go up. They asked him, how do you fix your algorithms? They asked him that question. You know what his response was? His response was, make more algorithms. That was his response. Fix the algorithms by making more algorithms. These are the people we're supposed to look up to, right? These are the people that we're supposed to consider smart, very high IQ, and look up to and say, oh, I wish I can be in their position. Wallahi, you do not wish to be in their position. They're losers, all of them. They're despicable losers, all of them. They're all slaves, again. And I'm sorry to be harsh, but it is what it is. We saw it with Elon Musk today. If you're keeping attention with the news, Elon Musk today. He goes and visits Israel and he's saying all these things about, that are complete lies and complete nonsense. And so many people are in the comment section being like, oh, I'm surprised that this happened. I'm not surprised at all. To be a billionaire, you have to sell yourself to worship money. No one can reach that level of wealth sincerely. It doesn't happen. Right? Floyd Money Mayweather, he literally says in interviews all the time, I worship the money. I go where the money goes. I'm telling you, there's no worse slave than that. When you're a slave to the world, there's nothing worse than that. When you're a slave to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're the most liberated and free person in the world. By Allah, Elon Musk, after what he did today, is the poorest man in the world, and the people in Gaza are the richest people in the world. Anyways. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, radiallahu ta'ala an. Now, what's interesting is that Zubair ibn Awam and Abdurrahman ibn Auf and Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, they all accepted Islam at the age of about 16 or 17 years old. All of them accepted Islam at 16 or 17 years old. And this will be important later. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas was the cousin of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's mother, Amina. So, second uncle or, whatever it is. He's also from the first dozen or so people to accept Islam, and he's also from the Ashra al-Bashara. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas was only 17 years old when he accepted Islam. Right? Now, if there's two verses in the Quran that can describe Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, it's the two verses in Surah Al-Luqman, verse 14 and 15, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and we have commanded people to honor their parents. Their mothers bore them through hardship upon hardship, and their weakness takes 2 years, or their weaning takes 2 years. So be grateful to me and your parents. To me is the final return. But if they pressure you to associate with me and you have no knowledge of, do not obey them. Still keep their company in this world courteously and follow the way of those who turn to me in devotion. Then to me you will all return, and then I will inform you of what you used to do. Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas was very close to his mother. And when his mother found out about his conversion to Islam, she was devastated. At that point, she was devastated. So what she did is she tried to talk him out of it first. But Sa'ad didn't budge. He showed love to her still, but he didn't budge. And so what this teaches us is that when it comes to the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, no matter who it is, we do not budge. Whether it's your parent, whether it's the imam at the masjid, whether it's your teacher, your professor, your boss, whether it's the leader of the country, the president, the king, I don't care which politician it is, which ruler it is. If the command is that you are going to have to disobey the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you do not have the obligation to follow it. As a matter of fact, it's the opposite. You have to forbid it. You have to speak against it. You have to push against it. Right? So, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his wonderful companion Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas teaches us a very great way to balance this. So at that time, his mother went on a hunger strike. She said to Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas that I'm not going to eat or drink anything until you stop this foolishness of Islam. So Sa'd, of course, he tried to talk her out of it, but she was insistent. So Sa'd's mother didn't eat or drink anything for 4 days straight. However, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, he didn't give up his faith. He says, "Ma, I can't give up this faith." But he was also stubborn too, like mother, like son. So he stood by his mother, holding bread and water, crying and urging for her to eat and drink for 4 days straight. And then she finally gave up the pursuit and she ate. Right? And then later came to terms with his belief. But Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas gives us that perfect example. That you don't abandon your parents or you don't abandon your loved ones because they're calling you towards disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You remain firm in your obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while still being loving and kind to them as best as possible. Fiqh-wise, the way this works is if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands something, so let's say the 5 prayers a day, right? This is an obligation on everybody. And your parents call you against that. So they say that you inconvenience everybody with your fajr because your alarm clock goes off and we all wake up in the house and it's very annoying. It's just a silly example. Could be a real example. People face this kind of stuff, especially converts. This is something that happens to a lot of converts where their parents or new Muslims, where their parents are still coming to terms with their new belief, and they find that the practices of their sons or their daughters is very inconvenient to their lives. So there was like a fuss that can be made, and it can be very difficult. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for all those who have to struggle with this. So the parents say, oh, no more Fajr alarm clock, right? Now, that's something that our Sharia will tell us that you cannot obey. However, when it comes to Sunnah, not Fard, when it comes to Sunnah or Mustahab, and your parents ask you to do something that might take you away from the Sunnah or the Mustahab, then it's actually obligatory to follow your parents as long as what they're calling to you towards is not disobedience. And at this point, some fuqaha even say that doing the Sunnah or the Mustahab can actually be considered makruh. So I'll give you another example. Let's say your mother needs you in the kitchen, right? Or your mother needs you to carry something, right? You haven't prayed dhuhr yet. So your mother tells you, I need you to take the trash out. I need you to help me in the kitchen. I need you to carry this for me over here. And I need it done ASAP, right? Now, this scenario, if you do this first, right? That would be the ideal, to just do it first and then go pray dhuhr in your sunnah. But if you do this first, you're going to end up missing dhuhr altogether. Let's just say that's the example. You pray dhuhr, you leave the sunnahs. As long as you pray your dhuhr, you go help your mother. If there's more time for sunnah after that, then alhamdulillah. If there isn't, then that's okay too. You helped your mother, which is a very rewarding thing as well, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for that, right? So that's kind of how it works fiqh-wise. When it comes to the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the obligatory things, there's no budging on that. When it comes to sunnah or mustahabbat, we can be a little bit flexible, depending on what you're calling me towards. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was known for his bravery in battles, right? His life revolved around the theme of family. And at the time of Hujjat al-Wada', the farewell Hajj, when the Prophet ﷺ and the companions performed Hajj, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, he became very, very sick, to the point that he was almost deathly ill. He thought that there was no recovery. It was very uncertain that he was going to recover. But he did, right? But Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas told the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that I don't have a significant amount of wealth, but like I have a good enough amount of wealth. Right? Like he's decently successful. He's like upper middle class kind of. Think of it like that. Or middle class, upper middle class. It's like I'm not like filthy rich, but I got a good amount to my name. So he said, my wealth is more than enough for my daughter. It's more than enough. So is it okay if I give 2/3 of my wealth as sadaqah? And Rasulullah ﷺ, he replied, no. So Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, he said, how about half? Rasulullah ﷺ replied, no. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas asked, what about 1/3? Rasulullah ﷺ said, yes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows you to give 1/3 of your wealth as sadaqah in your wirath, which is your will, that after you pass away, where your sadaqah or where your money, your wealth is distributed, that 1/3 can be allocated as sadaqah. However, 1/3 is like the maximum. That even is a lot. Like that's the max. And so Rasulullah ﷺ tells Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, rather than giving your money to sadaqah, it is more beneficial to leave your family members well off so that they don't end up on the streets. Right? So this teaches us a very important lesson. That when it comes to community, when it comes to building a strong community, what everybody needs to start off is everybody starts off with themselves first. Right? How do I build myself? How do I make halal income? How do I worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Build my spirituality, build my ta'alluq with Allah, my connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, my spirituality, and not leave behind the dunya things, because Islam is about a balanced lifestyle. Right? Islam is a holistic religion. It's not about just being in the masjid 24/7. Right? Everything that I do is ibadah. My striving in the dunya can be ibadah as well. So finding that balance in your life, and then you extend that out to your family, right? How can I help my family? How can I teach my kids? How can I teach my parents? How can I teach my spouse? How can I help in this regard? And if it's not teaching, maybe it's financial, right? How can I make sure that my parents are well off? My cousins, my siblings, my aunts, my uncles, so that they don't end up. And then after that, you start to extend out, right? And if you have these strong family units, individual family units, the stronger the community becomes. So one thing that often gets neglected is sadaqah to family. In our current day and age, because of how much hardship there is around the Muslim world, we want to quickly give sadaqah to all the different causes. And you should. Okay? Please do not misunderstand what I'm saying. Okay? And you absolutely should. But don't neglect your family. Remember, a lot of us have family members that are overseas. Okay? The zakat eligibility for an individual is around, by zakat eligibility, I mean the person that has to give zakat, the nisab, is someone that is about $6,000. Right? It's about $6,000. That if somebody has more than $6,000 to their name, they have to give zakat. If you're below nisab, then that means you're eligible for zakat. Right? It means you're eligible for zakat. But what happens, if you think about it, $6,000 overseas is a lot. You take that $6,000 and you take it to Egypt. Most people in Egypt don't have $6,000 saved. Is that right, Yusuf? That's right. So you'll be surprised how much of your family members are actually zakat eligible. And we constantly say like, oh, I can't find anybody to give zakat. Actually, you'll be surprised how many family members that you have that are actually zakat eligible. Focus on that, right? Next time you're calculating your zakat, you're allocating your zakat, think about, are there any family members that might be under the nisab that might need help? And prioritize that first, right? If you can't figure it out, then that's a good sign that your family needs a system. Your family needs to establish a system of how to discover who in your family is zakat eligible without diminishing the honor of those individuals, right? You don't just text in the family group chat, who wants some dough today, right? I'll tell you what my family does, if it'll be beneficial for somebody, right? We have a designated person, right, which is my grandma. She knows everybody in the family that is zakat eligible. Those who need zakat will tell her, and then everybody that gives zakat will give it to her, and she just distributes it. So you just have this one person that everybody trusts, it's trustworthy, and it can work that way, inshallah ta'ala, right? So, during the Battle of Uhud, when Rasulullah ﷺ was under attack, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas, he stood in front of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and he started launching arrows defending the Prophet, right? So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Irmi ya Sa'ad, Irmi ya Sa'ad, like keep shooting Sa'ad, keep shooting Sa'ad, keep throwing the arrows, because they were hitting, they were landing. He was knocking people out left and right, right? I want to make a Marvel joke here, but I think we're boycotting Disney, so I'm not going to do it. The Rasulullah ﷺ also told Sa'ad that, may my mother and my father be sacrificed for you, O Sa'ad, which is, in Arabic is a phrase where people say that basically means like, like I owe you, right? Like I have a lot of love for you. I have a lot of respect for you, and what you did for me is something that I'm always going to remember and always going to cherish and favor. However, this phrase was always something that the Sahaba would regularly tell the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ would rarely say this to another Sahabi, and he said it to Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas during this time in Battle of Uhud. Now, there's Talha ibn Ubaidullah, right, who is 16 years old when he accepted Islam at the hands of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. He is the cousin of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and he shared the message with Talha, and Talha was a successful businessman, a man of great character, also one of the Ashar Mubashara, the 10 companions promised paradise. He was a strong consultant to all the Khulafa after Rasulullah's death. Talha was the brother-in-law of Rasulullah. So Talha's wife was Hamna bin Jahsh, and one of the Prophet Muhammad's wives was Zainab bin Jahsh, who were sisters. And he narrated many ahadith from Rasulullah. On the day of Uhud, Talha ibn Ubaidullah also defended the Prophet very bravely. The Prophet was ambushed by a group of non-Muslims, by a group of the Quraysh, the Kuffar, and Talha ibn Ubaidullah came to his rescue and single-handedly wiped out a good majority of them with his sword, right? The Prophet ﷺ later remarked that whoever wants to see a living shaheed should look at Talha, right? He earned the status of a shaheed without dying because of his devotion to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Then there's Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah. He was older, between 25 to 30 years old when he accepted Islam, which is still not that old. But Rasulullah ﷺ referred to Abu Ubaidah as the most trustworthy person in this ummah. Right? He said Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah is the most trustworthy person in this ummah. He was very well known for his character before Islam. The Sahaba said that there were 3 people in pre-Islamic Arabia who were known throughout Mecca for their honesty, their trustworthiness, and their character. They did not engage in illicit behavior. They did not engage in the norms of Jahiliyyah, such as drinking, adultery, fornication, idol worship. Those 3 people were Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu, Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu, and Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah radiallahu anhu. Right? This is other than Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course, right? Because we already know Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was, pure as well. So Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anhu, he was put in charge during the time of the Khulafa of the Bayt al-Mal, which is something that was established during whose era? During the era of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, right? The Bayt al-Mal, which essentially is kind of like a royal treasury. It's a waqf, it's an endowment that helps manage government expenditures, right? So he was a very ethical businessman, and so because he was very trustworthy, he was a very ethical individual, very honest, he was put in charge of the Bayt al-Mal, right? He was put in charge of that because the Bayt al-Mal, it's a huge thing. You're basically handling the ummah's money. You're basically handling the ummah's money. So it had to be put to somebody very trustworthy. So the fact that it was given to Abu Ubaidullah ibn Jarrah is a very honorable, shows his honor as well. Now he was from Banu Taym, right? But from a different family in Banu Taym. He was the only one to accept Islam from his family, and because of that, he suffered a lot of persecution from his family. He joined the second group of Muslims that migrated to Abyssinia. And then when Rasulullah ﷺ arrived in Medina, he did hijrah to Medina from Abyssinia. And when he was there, he was paired with Mu'adh bin Jabal, who is another very trustworthy and great companion, right? Recognized game, essentially. Let's see here. Abu Ubaidah radiallahu anh, he would actually reject government positions. So the Khulafa would try to appoint him as governor for certain areas, and he would not have it. So one time he was actually appointed governor of Syria without his consent. He said the people just appointed him, and then they will let him know. Oh, by the way, you're in charge of Syria now, right? Just go, just accept it. He was so uncomfortable with leadership that he said, I'm here to serve the people. I'll advise, I'll teach, I'll help, I'll serve, I'll do whatever you need me to do, but just I can't accept positions of governorship, positions of leadership. I can't accept a position where I could do harm to another human being, right? One of the unfortunate things about leadership and why in Islam it is encouraged for people to be extremely careful when it comes to accepting positions of leadership is that it can be very easy to do injustice to another person, right? Sometimes it's almost inevitable. Sometimes it's almost inevitable that you have to do injustice to maybe some people in order to do less injustice to a greater group of people, right? There's actually a lot of examples of this in our Islamic history, and we can go on for a long time about it. So it's not a position that people should desire, right? Now it's a position someone should take up, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that those who are righteous and sincere, they guide them and reward them, and those who are insincere and they want to use it for corruption, then may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replace them with those who are sincere. Allahumma ameen. So Abu Ubaidah, he just was not comfortable at all with this idea that I could possibly do injustice to someone, so he just would not accept his position at all, right? Now, modern day, right, if you're someone who is most qualified and you're being asked to take up a position, you should take it up, because what oftentimes happens is the idea of being careful of leadership is something that is used as an excuse rather than sincerity. What do I mean by that, right? You're asked to, lead a volunteer effort or lead some type of thing. You're like, I'm humble, right? I don't lead things, right? I'll help, but I don't lead. And then the day comes where you got to help, and you're sitting in the corner, and you're like, I'm not in charge. So, so was it about you not accepting the leadership because, you don't want to lead things, or is it about you just not wanting to put in the effort, right? It is something that we have to check ourselves and something that we need to check our sincerity about constantly. And if you're ever appointed into a leadership position, whether you like it or not, that is why we have teachers, that is why we have ulama, that is why we have guidance, that's why we have dua, salah, and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for acceptance and guidance and sincerity and things like that. And surrounding yourself with people who are going to keep you in check, keep you humble, all is extremely important things. Then there is Sa'id ibn Zayd radiallahu anh, also one of the Ashra Mubashara, and was around 20 years old when he accepted Islam, and he was married to Jamil, who was the sister of Fatima bint Khattab, who was the sister of Umar ibn Khattab. So Sa'id and Fatima, they got married when they were in their teens, right? They were in their teens. And they were around 20 years old when they accepted Islam. They accepted Islam together. When Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu was going through his conversion, there was a time shortly before he converted where his confusion about Islam and idolatry was at an all-time high, which caused him to get very aggressive. So he found out, he was on his way to assassinate the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and somebody told him that your own sister has accepted Islam and your brother-in-law has accepted Islam. So that infuriated him, right? So that story where Umar ibn Khattab barges into his sister's house and then he beats up his brother-in-law, that's Sa'id ibn Zayd, right? That's Sa'id ibn Zayd who that happens to. And you know, we'll talk about Umar ibn Khattab's conversion in depth and a lot of lessons that we can learn. But the reality is that sometimes when people are the most angry and frustrated with Islam, that's the point where they're actually probably closer to accepting Islam than ever before. It happens all the time, right? You'll see all these like super right-wing extreme politicians, and then like next thing you know, they accepted Islam. Or that guy, I forgot which state, but somewhere in the South, it's always the South, right? Where there's this, this ex-military member who got radicalized when he was overseas, and he thought all Muslims were bad, and he was like, I'm going to go blow up the local mosque. And so he walks into the masjid to scout out the area, right? He's literally planning out where he's going to place bombs and blow it up and the whole kind of thing. And somebody comes and says to him, you know, Assalamu alaikum, would you like to sit down, have some tea, and they have a conversation. He gives them a Quran, and that's like, okay, he's like, maybe I should give it a shot before I blow up this place, right? And then he starts reading the Quran, and he's like, got you, right? This verse is something wrong with it. So then he goes to the sheikh and says, explain this verse to me. And the sheikh explains it very well. And then he realizes, oh, okay, that actually makes sense. And then he goes back and does that a few times. And then before you know it, he accepts Islam. And now not only did he accept Islam, but he's been in that masjid for like decades, and he serves that masjid. He's been on the board of that masjid, all this different type of stuff, and like he's constantly helping other, new Muslims coming in. He's giving da'wah across the country now. I forgot the guy's name, but I think many of you guys may have heard that story before. But so it happens. It happens a lot where people might be at this point in their lives where they're just like so against Islam. But in reality, what's happening is that they're actually closer to accepting Islam than ever before. And that's the summary of Umar ibn Khattab's conversion in a nutshell. Now, what's significant about Sa'id ibn Zayd is that his father was Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl, who was a staunch muwahhid. He was a monotheist before the revelation of the Quran. Before there was divine revelation, there were a few select people who were Hunafa. They practiced monotheism and they didn't worship any idols. And so Sa'id ibn Zayd's father, Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl, was one of those individuals. So when his family and tribespeople, Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl, the father, would have feasts every year, or sometimes they had feasts, they would sacrifice animals and would name their deities over the animals that they sacrificed. Zayd, he would not partake in eating that food. Right? He would not eat the slaughtered meat in the name of the idols. He would always bring his own food. Right? So because of this, Zayd would get persecuted by his family and tribesmen as well. And so Zayd represented Tawheed during a time where there was no Tawheed in the world. So years later, the Prophet ﷺ would praise him and say, on the Day of Judgment, Zayd ibn Amr ibn Nufayl, he will be raised as an ummah by himself. Right? This is the father of Sa'id ibn Zayd. And so Sa'id ibn Zayd was also always by the side of the Prophet ﷺ. He was one of the many men that stood in front and defended the Prophet ﷺ in the Battle of Uhud when there was an onslaught of attack against him. He will die in the year 51 after Hijrah, about 79 years old. And Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and Abdullah ibn Umar, two giant companions, oversaw the janazah of Sa'id ibn Zayd. So there are many examples of these companions, right? Sahaba that were mentioned that will congregate during the in Dar al-Arqam, the first 38, 40 companions who would face persecution. And there were more Sahaba who would meet in Dar al-Arqam, like Abu Salama, there's Abdullah ibn Abdul Asad, There's Al-Arqam ibn Abi Al-Arqam himself, Uthman ibn Mad'un and his two sons, Qudam and Abdullah, Ubaydah ibn al-Harith, Asma and Aisha, right? Both the daughters of Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anhu. There's Khabbab ibn al-Arat, right? Khabbab ibn al-Arat, his story is crazy. The amount of torture that he went through in the early days of Islam is just unbelievable. We'll talk about it more next week, but he was a slave, right? And so he was tortured relentlessly when he accepted Islam. He would, they would slash up his back. They would do a lot of nasty things to him. They would, drag his back on burning coals, and there was so much suffering that he would go through. The companions would describe that like his skin, like essentially like the back on his skin like melted away, like no ligaments, no muscle, anything. You couldn't find any of that on his back anymore. It was just bone basically, right? And so when he eventually recovered, he never actually fully recovered. His back was always deformed, it was always messed up. And so during the Khilafah of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, because sometimes we need reminders. Sometimes we feel like we're drained by our duties. There's a lot of weight. We feel compassion fatigue. We feel burnt out. So Umar ibn Khattab was no stranger to this. He was a human being as well. And being a Khalifa, you can't even imagine the amount of duties and responsibilities he had. So the amount of fatigue and burnout that this individual might have had is something that we couldn't even comprehend. One of the ways that he would motivate himself is he would ask to see Khabbab's back. He would ask Khabbab, can I see your back? And then as soon as he see your back, he would be like, this man's sacrifice would motivate Umar ibn Khattab to keep going, to keep striving for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and keep up with his duties, right? Like the sacrifices that they made. Khabbab ibn al-Arat, also about 16 years old when he accepted Islam, right? Umar ibn Abi Waqqas, right? The brother of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was about 13 or 14. He's one of the 14 shuhada in the Battle of Badr. He's one of the young men that begged Rasulullah ﷺ to join the caravan of Badr. And Prophet ﷺ originally, reluctantly, he was like, nah, didn't want the young people to go. He was scared to let the young people to go. He didn't want that to happen. But Umar ibn Abi Waqqas, he started crying and he was like, I just want to, I want to fight for the sake of Allah. I want to, serve the Prophet ﷺ for the sake of Allah. And so the Prophet ﷺ was so moved by his devotion to the deen of Islam that he allowed him to go and enter the group that was going to take the caravan in the Battle of Badr. But Umar ibn Waqqas, they say that he fought very bravely into the battlefield, and he was a shining light in the battlefield as well, and he will actually end up becoming a martyr in the Battle of Badr. There's Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, who's 16 years old. He was called a mu'allim by the other Sahaba. Right? Early people accept Islam, and he was called a mu'allim by the other Sahaba, right? The Prophet ﷺ even went as far as saying in a narration that if you hear it from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, certainly it came from me. Right? Certainly it came from me if you hear it from Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu. Right? So the early Sahaba, those who will become notable leaders in history, those who will become notable leaders in our deen, who are examples in our light, when they accepted Islam, and this is kind of the point of why I was breaking down each individual Sahabi today, right? So if you were bored, forgive me. But the point that I was trying to get to is this, right? And we'll probably just conclude here, inshallah ta'ala. The point is that all of them were what? What did you guys notice when I was listing off the ages? They're all young. They're all young. Ali ibn Abi Talib was 10 years old when he accepted Islam. Abdullah ibn Umar and Ubaydah ibn Jarrah, right? The son of Abu Ubaydah ibn Jarrah, both were 13 years old when they accepted Islam. Uqba ibn Amir was 14 years old when he accepted Islam. Jabir ibn Abdullah and Zayd ibn Haritha were 15 years old. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Khabbab ibn al-Arat, Az-Zubayr ibn al-Awwam, they were all 16 years old. Talha ibn Ubaydullah, Abdurrahman ibn Auf, Al-Arqam ibn Abi al-Arqam, the Dar al-Arqam, the owner of Dar al-Arqam, the house in which the Prophet ﷺ would congregate privately, secretly, because it was in the middle of the city, right? It was in the middle of the city, and since the city of Mecca was very busy, people can go in and out and kind of go unnoticed. Dar al-Arqam was ran by a 17-year-old kid. right? But that's the thing, they weren't really kids. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, right, 17 years old. Asma bint Abi Bakr, 17 years old. Mu'adh ibn Jabal, Mus'ab ibn Umair were 18 years old. Abu Musa al-Ash'ari was 19 years old. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who was given da'wah by his little brother Ali ibn Abi Talib, was 22 years old when he accepted Islam. There's Uthman ibn Khuwaylid, Uthman ibn Affan, Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah, Abu Hurairah, Umar ibn Khattab. They were older, they were like 25, 31, but all of them were cream of the crop, right? But Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the thing is, like, because oftentimes when we talk about Sahaba, we would talk about the persecution that they went through. And this is for me, you know, when I grew up, often what I imagined the persecution, the people that were going through the persecution was like a very strong man with like a white beard. Right? But these are kids. Khabbab ibn al-Arat was being dragged on burning coal when he was 16 years old. Bilal radiallahu anhu was a very young man when boulders were being put on his chest and he was being dragged in the streets and he was saying, Ahadun Ahad. I only worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ahad, Allah, Allah only. These were, in our days and age, we call them kids, but back then they were men. And that tells us that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did a very great job of recruiting those who were talented in his community. He picked quality. It was quality over quantity for him. He didn't care. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not care one bit how many people accepted Islam. His job was to spread Islam to the world. How many people accept is irrelevant. There are 2 billion Muslims in the world right now. These 40 are stronger than that 2 billion. It was not about quantity, it was about quality, and he picked that quality. And the quality came from young individuals because that's the generation that's going to have to take it forward. When you teach people at a young age, when you give them responsibility at a young age, you allow them to mature at a young age and find that leadership at a young age. When they become older, they can take that leadership anywhere, right? This is one of the disadvantages that we have today. I'm not calling for a reform or anything like that because I don't really know what the solution is. But one of the disadvantages that we have today, for example, our school system, is what we do is we pair age groups with age groups. So 8-year-olds, they'll only interact 40 hours a week with other 8 or 9-year-olds. 10-year-olds will only interact with other 10 or 11-year-olds for 40 hours a week, maybe more. But during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, you were 6 years old and you were carrying the bricks just like the 25-year-old, 30-year-old guy was doing. You were in the same gatherings as your father. You were learning how to herd sheep. You were learning how to fire a bow, how to ride a horse, how to swim, how to wrestle. So by the time they reached 14, 16 years old, they actually they have the maturity of like a 40-year-old today. Right? But again, these were young individuals. And so that also teaches us a lesson that the young folk are the people that we need to focus on when it comes to leadership, when it comes to empowering, when it comes to instilling confidence in them at a young age. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ would give them responsibilities and trust them wholeheartedly, even though they were young and they didn't have a lot of experience. That confidence, that building that confidence allowed them to thrive. We look at kids and we think they're just dumb. If anything, this Gaza genocide has taught us is that the future generation is not dumb. It's amazing what Generation X or Z, I don't know which one it is. Generation X or Z? Z? Yeah, Gen Z. Yeah, Gen Z, that sounds right. What Gen Z is doing on TikTok and stuff. It's like 13-year-old kids who are like doing more research than people have done their entire lives on the issue, and they're just disseminating this information all over TikTok. And so the Israeli government is literally like begging TikTok to be shut down because of a bunch of teenagers. So there's a lot of potential there. We just can't treat kids like they're stupid. And that's what happens. You don't know, you're dumb. Right? But that's the best way to just diminish someone's hopes and dreams right there. Right? But if you empower people, you give them tasks, you give them responsibilities, and you trust them with those responsibilities. You give them efforts, you give them movements to be part of. all right, good causes to be part of, then you'll see that leadership shine through, right? Whenever we do fundraisers for humanitarian efforts or whatever it is, wallahi, I always love calling on the high school volunteers. High school volunteers and young college volunteers, they will take your event and they will make it 10, 20 times better than you can ever imagine. Because they're dedicated. They're motivated, right? The 25-year-old who's married, has kids, 30-year-old who's married, has kids, they'll maybe give you like a phone call or two or something like that. But those young men and women, they have taken so many organizations in the Muslim Ummah in America specifically to great lengths, right? And it was all done by the young folk. So anyways, the point of today's lesson is two things, right? That Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he empowered young people, and he also brought the honorable people before Islam into Islam. The three most honorable individuals in all of Mecca, who did we say were? Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Uthman ibn Affan, aside from the Prophet ﷺ, right? Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Uthman ibn Affan, and Abu Ubaidah ibn Jarrah, right? These were three, or sorry, was it Abdurrahman ibn Auf? Yeah. These were three of the most trustworthy, most honorable people in all of Mecca. And the Prophet ﷺ, they all accepted under the hands of the Prophet ﷺ within a few short days of spreading Islam. The first few days of spreading Islam. And Rasulullah ﷺ, he told us this. He told us in a narration, الناس معادن كمعادن الفضة والذهب خيارهم في الجاهلية خيارهم في الإسلام إذا فقهوا. That people, ma'adin, they are like mines. كمعادن الفضة والذهب. They're like mines of silver and gold. خيارهم في الجاهلية, the best of the people during the time of Jahiliyyah. So if you're an honorable, great individual, positive individual during the time of Jahiliyyah, خيارهم في الإسلام. They were also the best people in Islam, right? If they have religious understanding. All right, inshallah ta'ala, we'll conclude here. And then next week, inshallah, if Allah permits, we will talk about the different ways in which the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam specifically was persecuted. And then we will talk about the specific ways in which some of the companions were persecuted during the early days of the Da'wat al-Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wa salamun al mursaleen. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Sallallahu ala sayyidina wa habib Muhammed wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Are there any questions? Sisters, brothers, online? Oh, yes. Yeah. So sister's asking about the zakat, about the $6,000, right? So what I was talking about was nisab, which is this concept of, a specific amount that a Muslim owns in terms of their wealth. And there's detailed breakdowns about this, and inshallah ta'ala, one of our goals here at MAP Seattle is every year before Ramadan, we're doing a zakat workshop, so we can go over the different things that are zakat, zakatable assets and things like that. This isn't going to be a full fiqh lesson on zakat, but essentially that you count the wealth that you have, and if it amounts to more than about $6,000, right, it changes because it's based on a gold standard, right? But today it's about $6,000. If it accounts as more than that, then you have to give zakat, right? You have to give zakat on the wealth that you own. If you're below that, you don't have zakat, you're technically zakat eligible, right? If you have less than nisab, right? And, okay, to be fair as well, there's also differences of opinion on that as well, right? It's not a blanket thing. Some scholars say that, no, in order to be zakat eligible, you have to be defined as someone who is a faqir, right? Or a miskin, or someone who is defined as someone who is, can be considered poor or in need of wealth. Somebody that has less than $6,000 doesn't necessarily mean they're in need of wealth, right? They could be living paycheck to paycheck, but they're still comfortable, kind of thing, right? So there's differences of opinion, and it can be kind of subjective sometimes. But the essence is that there is this idea that if you're below nisab, then you can be zakat eligible. So what I was talking about specifically with that is that we would be surprised how many of our family members overseas are zakat eligible, because the dollar can go a very long way in places overseas. So in Egypt, for example, if you take $6,000 and multiply it by like 33, 35 that the Egyptian pound is now, you're going to have a lot of money. 50 now? You're kidding. La hawla wa quwwata illa billah. You're joking. It was literally like 35 like 2 months ago. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu musta'an. Wow. Okay. That just took me for a shock right there. So what's that? 300,000 pounds? So in order for an Egyptian to be to have to give zakat, they have to have 300,000 pounds or more saved, which is a lot. It's a lot. So, when it's time for us to accumulate our zakat and give out our zakat, don't forget our family members, right? Don't forget our family members. Too often we rush to give it out to outside of our family, but we want to actually see if there is a way to give it to our family members first. And if you don't know who in your family could be zakat eligible, then that's a good sign that your family needs to implement a system where you do discover who is zakat eligible. And that can be anything. It depends on the family. They can determine however they wish to do it. But I gave the example of my family, which we do is you have one person that everybody trusts, which is my grandma in this case. And everybody that is zakat eligible in the family, she would know who they are. And those who can give zakat will give it to her, and she will distribute. That way everybody's honor is preserved, and no one feels bad, and no one feels guilty, or no one feels embarrassed. Wallahu ta'ala alam. Clear? It's good? All right, tamam. Any brothers? No? Okay. Chat? Nothing in the chat. Okay, jazakallah khair everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.